Alrighty, welcome back. Today we're going to continue. We have our search action. We're now going to try to implement this search bar. So let's come over to our side panel. We can come into our client, our SRC, and we can sort of figure out where we want to do this. I think we're probably fine to put this inside of features and posts. So inside of features and posts, we'll right click new file, and I'll call this searchbar.jsx. And then we'll start in the search bar and we'll build our way out. To get started, we are going to need some props in here. I'm going to go ahead and just import what we need to import right away, which is a bit of a spoiler, but we're going to use our useRef, and we're also going to have a prop types. We can then come in here and create our function. We can then close it. We can then come down here and do our prop types, and then we can do a export default for our search bar. You just make sure these prop types are what I actually had, which was a required string for the value, on search change, and the immediate change. We're going to start by initializing our refs with a null. This is for our search debounce ref. If you're not familiar with what debouncing is, think of it this way. Every time in the example when I typed into the search bar, like the word test, it would do a search. What we don't want to happen is to have the search function like this. I type the T, it hits the server, right? Hits the API. I type the E, it hits the API. What we want to happen here is we want to have something where it's like you typed T, let's wait 500 milliseconds before hitting the API. If you type the E within those 500 milliseconds, like before we hit our time limit, then we're going to wait another 500 milliseconds so that we're absolutely sure you're done typing, and then we'll go ahead and we'll do the search. It greatly reduces the amount of times you hit the API, which is just a good practice because you don't want to blow up your own system, right? For the actual div that we're going to be returning, the actual HTML, it's just going to be a quick little return for a div with an input of type equal to text, a placeholder that says search. Actually, we're just going to change this to search, a value equal to value that we're passing in, and then an on change that says handles search change, which does mean we need to actually create that on change. So let's go ahead and do that, that handle change. And we can go ahead and we can close this right here. For this handle change, first thing you want to do is get the e.target.value, which is going to be whatever they typed into the search bar. Then we're going to say, all right, update the search term immediately. This is our on immediate change function that we're passing in. Then we want to say, let's clear the existing timeout if it exists, just like our pseudocode said. And then after we clear that timeout, we're then going to set a new timeout. So what you'll see here is we're defining the timeout down here, and we're clearing it before we define it, which does require you to do a little bit of thinking. The way you generally write this the first time is you say, all right, I want a timeout. And then after you set up your timeout, then you go, oh, right, I do need to clear this and reset this. So I'm going to do that beforehand. It's just when you see the code logically, it doesn't make a lot of sense to clear something before it exists. It's just usually this part is written first, and then you retroactively add this. But this is effectively it for our search bar component, which means we can now come into our post list and actually try this. I'm going to go ahead and start our server with a Rails S. And then we'll go to localhost whatever, and we'll take a look at how many things we have here. So we have 4 or 5 different posts. So we're going to want to be able to at least search through those. So let's come over to our post list. And then in our post list, we'll have to do a couple of things. Up here, we have some imports currently. We are going to have to import that search bar. So let's start with that. We'll import the search bar. Then we're going to do a couple of other things, I think, because we're not really going to be using our fetch all posts anymore in here, at least. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this fetch all posts. I'm going to leave the delete posts for now. And instead, we're going to create a couple of hooks. Now, I'm calling these hooks. I'm not a React dev. What I'm basically doing here is adding some functionality and throwing it in a hooks folder. So, don't come to me for React advice. I understand it's probably a very outdated take on how you want to do things. But the reason why we're doing this is because we need to get the data for the posts, so get all of our posts. We also need to consider the parameters that are going to be in our URL. If we have parameters in our URL like search or the paginate stuff, we're going to need to handle those. In this case, we're handling the search stuff. So we'll go ahead and we'll deal with that. We'll take a look at those in a second. For now, what I want to do is I want to set up a couple other things. So in our post list here, I want to say, all right, we have a search term and a set search term, which we'll just use state for. I then want to do our debounce stuff. So we're going to have a debounce search term and a set debounce search term, which we're going to get from our use URL search param hook. So let's go ahead and let's create this use URL thing. We can come into our SRC, right click new folder, call this hooks. And then inside of hooks, we just want to create whatever this is. So I'll right click new file, call this use URL. What did I say? Use URL search param .js, I think is what I called it. And then we can come in here and we can create this real quick. So it's going to use state, and then it's going to have a couple of initial things we pass in. And then at the bottom here, it's just going to export default our search params. And then we're going to say this has a query. The query is going to come from a new URL search param. We're then going to set our param value and to an initial value where we say query, which is this URL search params, query.get the parameter name, which is going to be whatever parameter we have up here. Or it's going to be set to the initial value, which in this case is the empty string, unless you pass in a specific initial value. So maybe like when you load the page, you already have a parameter, you pass that in, for example, or something. I don't know what I was thinking. But we now have this use effect. Let's go ahead and let's set this up. So what we're going to do in this use effect, we're going to say there's a new URL, which is going to be if there is a param value, we're going to get the window.location.path name, question mark, param name equals param value. Else it's just going to be set to window.location.path name. This is probably going to change in a little bit, but for now, I think this is good enough for just doing the searching. We're then going to do a window.history.pushState with a empty object, the empty string, and a new URL. And this is almost definitely going to require you to look at this a bit as we build this out. I would not expect this to make sense right now because we haven't even set up the search thing. I'm just creating the whole component here so that we can just, look at it in its entirety and say, all right, this is sort of what it does. So all we're doing here is we're just going to be reading and writing to the URL, depending on whatever's in the search bar, right? So we have our search params, which we can now set in our post list, right? The next thing we need to do is we need to actually do the post data stuff, which we're now going to move into a use post data hook, which is our other one here. So let's come into our hooks folder again. This one will hopefully make a lot more sense than the last one. We'll say use post data.js. In our use post data, we need to do a couple things. We need to import our use state and use effect. Then we're also going to import fetch all posts as well as this thing called search post from our post service. So you can probably see where we're going with this. We're either going to be fetching all of our posts if the search bar is empty, or we're going to be searching specific posts if the search bar has something in it. And then we can come down here and export this again. So all we really pass into this one is just our search term. We then do what we did before, where we set the posts, the loading, and the error to just be their default values. We then have one use effect, and then we have a return at the bottom. I'm going to do the return first. These are the things I expect to return, which is just these three. And then we're going to have a use effect. We're going to do this. We can then close this, and we're just going to put the search term into our array here. Then we create a async function inside of this use effect, which is going to be our load posts. In here, I'm just going to copy all of this because we've done this so many times before. We're going to call this load posts. We're going to do a try and a catch. We're going to say let data. If we have a search term, so if we've searched for something, we're going to go to the search posts in our post service. If we don't have a search term, we're just going to go to fetch all posts, which is exactly what we had before. It's just the in our post service right here, it's the index page thing. It goes to the index page for our posts, and we're good there. The one thing that we have to be aware of here is the search posts doesn't exist yet, and we do need to refactor the fetch all posts a little bit. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at why we have to do that. If we come into our post service, the only thing we're really importing is the API URL. And I'll remind you that in our constants API URL, we're grabbing the Vite API URL, and this is coming from our env development. In here, we're going straight to /post, but where we actually need to go now is not to /post. We now need to go to API/v1/search, and then like /post, for example. So we need to change our env around a little bit. So I'm going to rename this first one from Vite API URL to Vite Posts API URL, which is going to go to /post. And then I'm going to do one for search, which is going to be the search API URL, which is going to go to API v1/search, which does mean we're going to have to change a couple of things in like the rest of our bubble up. So we have our API URL up here. This is now going to be our posts API URL, which is going to import that Vite posts as opposed to the Vite API URL that we had before. We're going to do the same thing for the search. We're going to export our search API URL, and we're going to import that from our environment as well. And we can close both of these, and we can come back into our post service. Now in our post service, what we want to do is import both of those as opposed to this API URL. Then wherever we were using the just API URL before, we now want to use this post API URL, just like that. And then at the bottom, we want to do something for our search. So we'll do that below the delete, where we just create a search post. It's going to have a const response. It looks just like the fetch all posts we had up here, where we did fetch for a post API URL. But we're going to the search API URL, which is, again, I'll remind you, it's going to go to API/v1/search. And then we're going to add to that /post/ and then our *q equals ... just like Copilot is suggesting. So that's where this URL is coming from. We then pass in our query. That's equal to our Q parameter, because in our search controller, we're looking for a Q parameter. So we're just making sure those match up. And then we say, if the response isn't okay, throw an error, otherwise return the JSON response. The final thing we have to do in here is just add this to our list of exports for our search posts. And then we have to figure out what it's still unhappy with in here, because it's clearly upset about something. It's this one right here. So we'll grab the post API URL. We'll do this refactor. And again, during this whole process, you can run your tests and just make sure that this doesn't like break anything super major. A couple tests will start to fail, but we'll fix those in the future. Okay, so now that we have that, we can come back into our post list. So in our post list, we're going to have a bunch of errors now because we have a bunch of things that we need to actually handle, right? So what we want to do is we want to come into our first use effect here, where we were previously doing this use effect to load our posts. And what we want to do instead now is grab this, and we're just going to replace this with a use effect that says if there's any fetched posts, which we get from our use posts hook, which goes to the post API. So if that attempt to contact the post API returns any posts, we then want to set the posts to be those posts. Pretty simple stuff. And anytime the fetched post changes, we can then go ahead and do this. Our delete post handler here still does the set posts with the filter, etc. We can move this around a little bit if we want to, but for now I think this is largely fine. Then we want to add two more things, which are going to be, one is our handle immediate change, which was what we pass into, I think it's into our search bar or something. That just sets the search term to be that search value. And then we handle the debounced search change, which happens after 500 milliseconds or whatever, where we just set that. What all of that allows us to do now, all of this prep allows us to, if you can believe it, just come in here, let's say maybe above the rest of this stuff, where we have like our title and stuff, we can then add whatever we want to in here. So we're going to take this, we have our post map right here. We can add in like the, our loading and errors if we want to. And then above that, we can add in the search bar. We pass in our value, which is our search term, which we have right here, which is initially set to the empty string, but then later gets set in, when we set our search term. We then have our on search change, which is our handle debounced search change. And then we have our on immediate change that we pass in, which is our handle immediate search change. And if we come into our search bar, you can see the on search change is used right here for our set timeout, and the on immediate change is set right here. All of that works just fine. The only other thing we want to do now is get rid of this set loading and set error, because those are now coming from our hook and not from that initial piece of state. So if we save all of this, we can come over here, we can refresh. You can see we have a search bar, which means I haven't broken everything. If I Control-Shift-I, we don't have any errors, which is a miracle considering how many pieces of code I just touched that were in JavaScript. And then let's go ahead and let's test this. Let's just type the word test. And you can see test2 appears, test2 appears, test appears, and test appears, but there's no hello. So now let's try searching for hello instead. You can see it does take a second, or half a second, I should say, to update, but now we only have hello here. If we search for world, that will also cause hello to appear, because again, I'll remind you, hello has world in the body. So now what we have is we have a functioning search bar. To an extent, if I click on like post list, for example, it will not clear this. Additionally, the parameter, if I type in world here, if I type in world, actually I have to refresh and then type in world. And then if I go to this URL specifically from our homepage, if I do this, and I search for, or I go to this specific URL, this will cause us to see hello, which is good. But again, it's not going to be the same thing as, you know, just being able to go to the post list and go back to the homepage. So that's something else we have to fix because of how we have these things set up. The other thing that I want everyone to be aware of at this point is we are going to start running into an issue where instead of loading each page once or twice with the component initial renders, we're going to be doing like 6 or 7 initial renders. So that's something else we have to clean up in the future. So if you start doing a console log in here, console.log for, I don't know, just the word test, you'll see test is going to start appearing multiple times. That is something we're going to clean up, but it's going to require us to rethink sort of how we're structuring a lot of these components. So for now, I'm going to leave you here with our search bar search feature implemented. So we'll do a git add dot, git commit -m, and we'll say, this is technically episode 2, implemented search, right? And we can go ahead and we can do a git push for this one, and that'll push this up. But that's going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in the next part where we implement the pagination.